This is Tim O'Brien reporting from Seattle on November 1st, 2025. Before we move to today's news, I want to just address a little bit of feedback. My daughter said, "Your news stories are interesting, but you're just moving through topics as if everyone understands everything you're saying." So I'm going to say this. I'll cover technical topics. I'm not going to shy away from what's interesting to me, and some of that is very technical. But I am going to stop and make more of an effort to explain some of the concepts. And now for the day's news from Hacker News. We have a survey of popular stories, and we pick 3 to feature. The first news story is Torchlight exposes 29 zero-day exploits in 12 million IoT devices hidden on Tor. Researchers developed Torchlight. It's a tool that analyzes Tor traffic network to detect attacks on cloudless IoT devices. Over 12 months, analyzing 26 terabytes of Tor traffic, they discovered 45 vulnerabilities, including 29 previously unknown zero-day exploits. These exploits affect approximately 12.71 million IoT devices across 148 countries. Devices most people don't even know are exposed to the internet. Why this matters. This is the IoT security nightmare we've all been warned about for years, except it's probably worse. These aren't just connected fridges and thermostats. These are industrial controllers, security cameras, and network equipment that people thought were safe because they were cloudless. Turns out, plenty of them are reachable through Tor, and attackers have been quietly exploiting them. Let me back up and explain some terms here. First, IoT stands for Internet of Things. Basically, any device that connects to the internet that isn't a traditional computer or phone. You probably have a few right now. Thermostats, cameras, industrial sensors in factories, traffic light controllers, equipment in power plants. If it's connected to a network and has a chip in it, it's probably an IoT device, and there are billions of them. Let's talk about Tor. Tor is an anonymity network originally developed for privacy advocates and whistleblowers. It routes internet traffic through multiple encrypted layers. It's nearly impossible to trace where it came from, but there have been cases where law enforcement has used compromised machines to be able to track down who's using Tor for what. So Tor is one of those technologies that is used by both dissidents and authoritarian countries. It's used by good guys and bad guys. And the reason I'm bringing that up is because most people only hear about Tor in the context of a story about hackers or people trying to break into computers. But Tor was developed by the U.S. Naval Research Laboratory in the mid-1990s. Tor stands for the Onion Router, and it was developed by David Goldschlag, Mike Reed, and Paul Syverson. And if you want to learn more about Tor, or if you want to install it and use it, see the links in the show notes. So let's get back to the story. Torchlight is a research tool developed by security researchers and presented at Usenix Security 2025. What they did was essentially set up monitoring on the Tor network, watching 26 terabytes of traffic flow through it over an entire year. They were looking for patterns that indicated attacks on IoT devices. Think of it as an eavesdropping on the dark web to see which devices attackers were targeting and how they were doing it. What makes Torchlight's findings particularly alarming is the scale. 29 zero-day means that there are security holes the manufacturers don't even know exist yet. And we're talking about 12.71 million devices spread across 148 countries. Just how many countries are there anyway? That might be all of them. Some of these devices might be controlling critical infrastructure, water treatment plants, power grids, factory equipment, and their owners have no idea that they're even vulnerable. Here's a specific example. One of the vulnerabilities they discovered was an industrial network switch, the kind of equipment that routes network traffic in factories or office buildings. Attackers were exploiting a flaw in the web management interface that let them gain complete administrative control without authentication. Once they had access, they could monitor all network traffic, redirect communications, or even shut down the network entirely. And because that attack came through Tor, it was nearly impossible to trace back to an attacker. Imagine a factory production line or a hospital network just being controlled by someone on the other side of the world who got in through a device that was supposed to just quietly route packets off the internet. I'll translate this story in summary. This is Torchlight essentially letting us know that someone's already compromised these systems, and they are waiting for commands from an adversary that might be impossible to trace. For more information about this story, see the links in the show notes. Today's programming language story is about Frink, a programming language that actually understands physics. Alan Eliasson is the creator, and this is also featured from Hacker News. Frink is a programming language designed specifically for physical calculations that tracks units of measurement. The language prevents unit conversion errors by treating units as first-class citizens. You can't accidentally add meters to seconds. It includes built-in constants for thousands of physical values, speed of light, Planck's constant, and can handle calculations across widely different scales. Now this matters. Unit conversion errors have literally destroyed spacecraft. NASA's Mars Climate Orbiter burned up in 1999 because one team used imperial units and another used metric. Frink is designed to make that category of error impossible. The language itself knows the difference between feet and meters and won't let you mix them. If you write 5 meters plus 3 seconds, Frink will refuse to compile. But if you write 5 meters divided by 2 seconds, it automatically knows that the result is 2.5 meters per second, a velocity. The language understands dimensional analysis at a deep level. You can ask it to convert miles an hour to furlongs per fortnight, and it just works because it knows what all those units mean. The language also handles extreme scale differences that would break typical floating point math. You can calculate astronomical distances and subatomic particle masses in the same program without losing precision. Frink uses arbitrary precision arithmetic and keeps track of units through every calculation. So you can compute things like how many hydrogen atoms would fit in the volume of the sun without writing conversion code. Now, Frink isn't the only language to tackle this problem. F# has units of measure built into its type system, and there was an ambitious Sun Microsystems project called Fortran that tried to do this for scientific computing before being discontinued in 2012. But what makes Frink special is that unit tracking isn't just a feature, it's the entire reason the language exists. Frink has been around since 2001, created by Alan Eliasson. It doesn't appear to have a huge community. In fact, it's not open source. That's the only curveball here. Maybe if enough of us download it and start to use it, we can convince Alan to make it open source. If you want more information, please see the links in the show notes. Today's Weird Bucket story is interesting. It's astronomical. The world's largest camera finds 2,000 asteroids in its first 10 hours of operation. And this is a story by Anthony Gorefa on Tweaktown. The Vera C. Rubin Observatory in Chile activated the world's largest digital camera with 3,200 megapixel sensors. In just its first 10 hours of operation, the camera discovered over 2,000 new asteroids. The camera is so powerful it could spot a golf ball on the moon's surface. And this represents only 0.05 of its goal to map 20 billion galaxies. Why this is interesting, sometimes you'll fire up a new piece of equipment and it just works beyond your wildest expectations, and that's what happened here. The first night, they turned on the camera and immediately started finding asteroids no one knew existed. And I just want to talk about a 3,200 megapixel sensor. It's so absurdly large that it can see a golf ball on the moon. Just for context, your iPhone has about 12 megapixels, and that's impressive. This camera has over 250 times that resolution, and in 10 hours of operation, it found 2,000 asteroids. That's just a warm-up. The camera's actual mission is to photograph 20 billion galaxies over the next decade, creating the most detailed map of the universe ever made. But I also want you to think about that. We found 2,000 asteroids floating around our own solar system that we had no idea existed until last week. Some of them might pass close to Earth, and I'm not trying to be alarmist, and some of them might be valuable for future mining operations. Some might just be interesting rocks in space, but until the Rubin Observatory switched on its camera, they were totally unknown. And this is an interesting story, but one logical follow-up question is this a big deal? So there are approximately 1.1 million known minor planets and asteroids in our own solar system. And if you think about minor asteroids, there's tens of millions, that's the estimate. So this isn't a huge story. It's not like we need to start digging our bunkers now. But I do hope that that observatory didn't have a scene like the opening scenes from Don't Look Up. On that note, I will also point to spaceweather.com. They have a good tracking of near-Earth objects and potential collision events. And if you worry about things as much as I do, this is something you check more often than you should. In other news today, Apple's been found guilty of abusing its App Store dominance in the UK, potentially facing hundreds of millions in damages after a tribunal ruled that they charged developers unfair commissions. Myanmar's military just shut down a massive online scam operation near the Thai border, detaining 2,000 people and seizing Starlink terminals. And the California State University, all 460,000 students, is partnering with Amazon, OpenAI, and NVIDIA to become what they are calling America's, quote, first AI-empowered university, which is either the future of education or a future Black Mirror episode. We'll see how this turns out. Happy November, everybody, and if you're interested in any of these stories, please see the notes for links. Okay, so this is the weekly review episode. If you've been listening to this podcast, and there's a few of you, and you've already heard all of the episodes, I'm going to just do a quick couple minutes talking about the podcast and about where I am. And then I'm going to follow that with a review of this week's story. So first, a personal note. I've been doing this for a week, and I managed to publish an episode every day for 7 days in a row. I haven't advertised this podcast or tried to draw much attention to it because it's more an experiment to see how much effort is required to sustain a daily podcast. And from the first week, I've concluded that it's probably not in the books for me to maintain a daily schedule going forward. That being said, I am enjoying covering the news, and it wouldn't be unreasonable to spend 30 to 40 minutes in the morning every day to cover 3 interesting technical stories. I'm not making any promises here, but that could be something to look for over the next few weeks. What's not sustainable about this process, you'd be surprised. Generating suitable content doesn't take that much time, and the actual recording is relatively straightforward. It usually takes about 40 minutes to record 30 minutes of audio. I often have to stop and start a few times, but it's a relatively quick process. What takes the most time is removing pauses and white space from the recorded audio. Some of you gave me feedback about Wednesday and Thursday asking me if I was using an AI voice. And the answer is no, this is me. But for those days, I did use an online tool that uses AI to cut out pauses, and my conclusion is that it's not reliable. To make the problem more exact, I found that it was cutting off the end of words and making the end product a bit too choppy. I'll continue working on that, but it usually takes around an hour to remove white space and pauses from 30 minutes of audio. And that's not a sustainable thing to do. That's the long pole in the tent, but that also might be too much inside baseball. You're not coming here to hear me talk about making a podcast. But the other question I'm getting from people is, what's the purpose of this? That's a good question. Let's just say I had more time over the last week than usual, and I decided that it was time to try something that I had been toying around with for a couple of years. Start a podcast and measure how technical content could be integrated into this medium. I listen to a lot of podcasts, and I won't go into the full list, but I have recently found that technical podcasts are just not living up to what I need. They're either vacant manosphere podcasts that tend to veer into politics, or they're a bunch of people having interviews over and over again about the same thing. And again, I'm not going to name these podcasts here because I'm not looking to start a fight. But I'm also getting tired of technology podcasts that are run by an interest. And you'll hear me use that word a lot. When I say the word interest, I'm talking about a company or a project. A technology podcast about a technology or programming language that happens to also be funded and recorded by the company that sponsors that technology. Now, I did that earlier in my career. I worked for startups and recorded audio content, video content, and it was unrewarding to record as it was to listen to. Everything I said and everything I wrote had to have a marketing angle. And even if I found the story interesting, it was still associated with a sponsor. Even if I was getting 1 million hits for something, it was still 1 million hits in service of selling a product. So I couldn't cover all the stories I wanted to cover. During that brief period of time I worked for O'Reilly Media as a part-time journalist, I was covering interesting stories, but I made the mistake of getting too deep into a couple stories that weren't sustainable. I was starting to propose interviews with Julian Assange. I was covering stories like organized criminal use of email servers. And that's just not something that the organization was ready to support, and nor was I qualified to cover some of those stories. And I'll leave some of that to another episode. But there's another motivation. Popular science and popular technology reporting tends to ruin the topics it covers. Just wait until there's a complex outage that happens with AWS, or there's a novel vulnerability in an IoT device that brings down all the traffic lights in a major city. Whenever, quote, the news covers these stories, They barely even start to explain the basics. So you end up having to listen to other podcasts or commentators comment on things they have no idea what they're talking about. But something is wrong in our society. You don't actually have to know what you're talking about to report it these days. So a lot of the technology news, a lot of the healthcare news, a lot of the political news, it's all just nonsense. And I was getting so frustrated, I want to take a stab at covering technology in a way that I would listen to. So one of my goals here, and the reason why I start every day with security, programming, and the weird bucket, is because I'm trying to use this news section as a way to point people towards interesting topics and technology stories while also providing some context and at times some explanation. I'll explain my approach by telling you what I listen to. I listen to podcasts that you wouldn't expect me to listen to. I am fascinated by the law. I love listening to Ken White on a podcast called Serious Trouble. He explains the intricacies and nuances of federal law. Whether he's covering the legal troubles of a president or a former hip-hop star, I actually enjoy getting into the details of professions I don't practice. So for me, one of the things I'm trying to do is record a podcast that is technical that regular people can listen to. And I don't expect everybody to understand everything, but I am also convinced that there are non-programmers and non-technical listeners that want to see a little bit beyond the technology stories they might read in the Washington Post or the New York Times. There's also another reality about technology that I don't think a lot of people understand. Just because I'm in IT, just because I work on some fairly advanced technology, doesn't mean I understand every other story that comes out of IT. Another thing I'm trying to do here is talk about security, talk about programming. I want that Python programmer to know what's happening in Rust, because they might not understand it. I want that security practitioner to understand what's happening in FinOps, because that crosstalk is really useful. I've been in enough IT departments over several decades now to know that technologists can be very specialized, very cloistered, and isolated. And one of the things I want to do is create a technical podcast that acknowledges that there's a bridge that needs to be built across different parts of technology. So that's my promise to you. I'm trying to create a podcast that's interesting to listen to, a podcast that covers interesting stories. I'm not going to chase traffic. I'm probably not going to purchase advertising. And frankly, I'm not looking at my statistics more than maybe once a week. But I'll also own up to a failure. I haven't been stopping to explain enough over the last week. As I said previously, my daughter was talking to me last night and she was like, "Great podcast, but you're moving real fast. You're not really stopping to explain anything. Do you just assume that everybody knows everything?" And it reminds me of the lesson I learned when I wrote a book for O'Reilly. It was 2004 or 2005, I forget. Those years are kind of a blur. And I picked up Jakarta Commons as an open source project, and I decided to propose a book on that. It's a very simple project. I proposed a cookbook on it. And so one of the things I was going to do, and I was attracted to O'Reilly Media because they write books that have narrative structure, they're technology books, they take a little bit more of a philosophical approach to what they write. So I start to write the copy, and my editor is like, "You have to explain everything." No, I mean everything. You can't just write a book and assume that people know X, Y, and Z. They didn't buy the book if they understood it. They need you to explain it. That same process, I'm going to try to apply that to the podcast. But it's arduous. It takes time. So if you catch me talking about something and you're like, "I don't understand what this even means," please let me know. 2 examples. In yesterday's podcast, I believe I mentioned 2 things, and somebody sent me a question. "What's a man cage, dude? That sounds interesting, but I don't know what it is." I also talked about red teams. So let me explain what a man cage is formally. It's a small enclosed area with 2 or more interlocking doors, such that only one door can open at a time. Individuals must be authenticated before entry or exit, and access is granted only if required security conditions are met. Example, biometric verification, badge scan, weight sensor. This configuration prevents tailgating and piggybacking. And so what that means is if you work at a corporation, they might have a badge that you have to scan to open a door. One of the rules is you can't scan into the door and have the person behind you just jump in. They also have to scan in. If you run a data center, the reason why you might have a man cage is because it is a super secure space. And you want to make sure that everybody who is there is authenticated to be there, has the right access. to access the space. A man cage, and I've only been through 2 of these in my time, is a little bit intimidating. Because you walk into a man cage, it's usually, the ones I have been cylinders of glass. You walk in and the door closes and you're literally locked into a cage. And then you have to use a biometric authentication mechanism. In the case of the Equinix location that I was visiting more than a decade ago now, I had to scan my palm. And if that palm scan matched, then the exit door opened. So in some sense, an ultra-secure environment has a man cage, and it's a little bit of a threatening experience. But if you don't authenticate correctly, you're not able to enter the space. It also, in a weird way, provides a way to, stop someone from leaving if you don't think that they're authorized to be there. The other term I used, just casually assuming you all understood what it was red team. So what's a red team? I've worked at places that have red teams, and it's a really interesting team. They're literally a team that's there to break in. They're an independent group that emulates potential adversaries' behaviors and techniques. If you work at a place with a red team, there's a bunch of friendly people over in that other room. Their job is to break into your stuff. It's pretty interesting. So last, I want to talk about the experiment. In the first episode of this podcast, I said this is an experiment. And it's also an experiment that's related to my Medium writing. I recently started writing more on Medium, and I've gotten some good reaction to a few stories. Mike Lukides at Eerily has been linking to a few of my stories from Radar, and this podcast is really me dipping my feet back into audio work. One thing I've been trying to understand is how this work relates to writing. If you read my Medium post now, you'll notice I put links to this podcast into the post, and I still don't know if that's the right or wrong decision. But the one thing I know is I'm going to keep this experiment going. We'll see where it takes us. Thank you for listening. And what you're going to see next is a review of the stories from this week. Okay, so that's the introspective weekly summary. It was a bit long, I'll own that. And what follows is a highlight reel of this week. If you've already listened to this week's episodes, there's nothing new here for you. But if you haven't, this is a quick review of some of the stories that are available. I'll start with Saturday, October 26th, the Fork It and Forget decade. This episode set the tone by exploring how open source has evolved through distinct decades. The insight I was trying to share was that 1990s were a rebellion. Open source was starting to show up. The 2000s was really the star stage. Developers started to feel like celebrities as companies started to put more money into open source. The 10s were a great decentralization enabled primarily by Git. And now the 2020s is being affected by Gen AI. So I go into more detail in that story. I think Git, introduced by Linus Torvalds in 2006, was one of the most important developments of this century, not just because of the technical features, but because it fundamentally changed the power dynamics in open source. It made forking trivial, where prior to Git, forking was seen as an aggressive act. I think fork democratized open source and made competition more acceptable. Looking forward, this episode raised the provocative question, what happens when GitHub contains 1 billion repositories, many of which are going to be created by AI agents that humans might not fully ever review or understand? This is happening quickly. On Sunday, October 27th, I had the fine print that AI forgot. This episode tackled legal issues that most developers ignore. The complex web of licenses, terms of service, and end-user agreements that govern how we use Gen AI. The core message is that developers need to stop pretending to be lawyers, but they also need to understand some of these legal documents. These are no longer someone else's problems to understand and solve for you. You need to read these documents and understand how the technology is affected by legal restrictions. And the reason is because your lawyers need your help. One of the most compelling examples that I brought up was switching between AI models mid-conversation in Cursor. If you move from Claude to ChatGPT, most of the terms of services explicitly prohibit using model output to train another. But it's a gray area, and I think millions of developers are walking through without fully understanding this every single day. Another prediction, software vendors are going to start adding explicit clauses about how their software relates to the Gen AI tools that you're using. And this is also already starting to happen. On Monday, October 28th, I had a podcast entitled Your Code Might Outlive You. And this was a direct response, a challenge to a professor who would apparently tell students not to worry about code longevity, that it'll, quote, all be rewritten anyway. The episode made a passionate case that rewrite culture is destroying institutional knowledge and wasting enormous amounts of money. The main message is that we don't train developers to read and maintain, we train them to create, and this creates perverse incentives where the path to promotion is creating rather than maintaining. This leads to a constant reinvestment to reinvent wheels from scratch. Tuesday, October 29th, I had a post called The Humble Programmer 53 Years Later, and this is a reflection on Edgars Dijkstra's 1972 Turing Award lecture, and this lecture reads like it was written yesterday. It reads like it was written about 2025 and the challenges programmers face with Gen AI. The same anxiety existed 53 years ago, as does today. In light of this week's news, the number of layoffs that happened at Amazon, where people are finding themselves as programmers, I think it's important for us to go back to this lecture and read it. This is Dijkstra asking programmers to stand up and take ownership of their profession. And in 1972, people thought programmers were overpaid clerks. That's not dissimilar from how some people think about programmers today. But that's not the case. Even with Gen AI, programming will always be very difficult. So if you're looking for something to maybe give you some energy, if you're out there on the job market again this week, this post might cheer you up a little bit. Wednesday, October 31st, I wrote a post called The Reality of Utilization Reports. And this was a deep dive into why FinOps is way more complicated than just looking at CPU utilization percentages. I referenced Brendan Gregg's crucial insight that CPU utilization percentages are basically a lie. And I firmly believe this. I have talked about this for hours on end, even if people don't want to hear it. But I think it's something that we need to understand from a FinOps perspective, but also from a general technology perspective. The metrics that we use to measure utilization fundamentally flawed. And no one really wants to talk about it because it's a complex topic. I don't think most people understand how CPUs work. I think most developers just say, whatever, it's a percentage. The reality is that if you support databases and other complex workload types, CPU utilization percentages are insulting. So listen to that if you want more information. On Thursday, October 31st, and I just realized that these days are wrong. October 31st was Friday. What is going on here? Anyway, this week ended with a nuanced take on DHH's public cloud exodus. This episode didn't argue that DHH was wrong. It actually defends his decision, but it raises important questions that you need to ask to assess your situation. I see a lot of people taking DHH's post, retweeting it, celebrating it, and then taking it back to work and saying, let's also do the same thing he did because private cloud is cheaper than public. In certain cases, that is absolutely true, and I've been responsible for that in the past. But there are things you need to understand, specifically security, risk. I talk about black swan events, and if you really want to learn about the Chelyabinsk meteor event in 2013, this is the podcast for you to listen to. Looking ahead, the first week I covered a lot of ground. I posted something every single day. And I've talked previously about that might not be a sustainable approach, but it was fun. What I want you to understand is that one of the common themes of the podcast is it's more complicated than that. And that phrase appeared repeatedly throughout the week. That's potentially a good name for the podcast. Technology decisions rarely have simple answers, and anyone selling you a simple answer is probably selling you something. So that's another thing I want to point out. In this podcast, you haven't heard an ad. I haven't sold anything. I haven't mentioned a company. I'm going to try to preserve that and keep this a space where you can come and listen to me talk about ideas and opinions without breaking out to an ad that's trying to sell you software. So enjoy your week, and we'll see what happens in the next week. Should be interesting.